As spring football 2025 nears the end of the offseason, what are some of the biggest burning questions emerging for the New York Giants ahead of training camp? I'll run through some of those coming up next here on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credentialed member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all of our written work. And as always, we welcome on in our Blue Crew community members, our everydayers, our newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's show, I thought we could take a look at some of the biggest burning questions that have started to emerge ahead of training camp. Now, the Giants don't report to training camp until later next month, but already there are some questions that have started to emerge, and we're going to go through 5 of them here on today's show, including what's progress, Joe and Schoen and Brian Daboll and their status. We're going to take a look at what the biggest question is ahead of camp. We're going to take a look at 2 young players who basically can be comeback players this year with good performances in the summer. And then who is on the hot seat for the New York Giants. So that is what we're going to cover today. Again, welcome on in to everybody. Let's get into it. All right, we're going to start off with progress. Now, we go back to what John Mara, co-owner, said at the end of last year and how he needs to feel better about the Giants by the end of this year than he did, at the start of this year. So what is progress for the Giants? And I have a few things that I think would qualify for what we need to look at. We being, fans and media, what do we need to see in order to say that, yes, the Giants are headed in the right direction? First thing that needs to develop is the growth amongst the players. Now, by that, I mean you need to see the young guys as well as the older veterans progress week in and week out. You can't see them making the same mistakes. You can't see them struggling. They've got to be better by week 18 than they were in week 1. And that comes down to coaching. So if the Giants can't get that to happen, this team has no chance of developing. It has no chance of being successful. There has to be growth in the young players. And especially now, when you think about it, the Giants have had draft classes that are now starting to stick on the team. So they're starting to replace what was previously an older foundation they need for these younger guys to really solidify, progress, and develop. So that's going to be on the coaches, obviously. Part of that's going to be on the players. But the Giants definitely need to show growth in the young players. Now, part of that growth is also discipline, right? So we can't have pre-snap penalties. On offense last year, Giants had 40 pre-snap penalties. Can't have that. We can't have penalties that kill drives, scoring drives, right? I didn't take account on that, but there were quite a few last year where the Giants were driving, and then all of a sudden, there's a penalty on third down, third and short, that turns it into third and long, or there's a penalty that knocks them out of the red zone or outside of the deep red zone. You can't have that. And on the flip side of that, you can't have penalties on third down if you're on defense, such as defensive pass interference or anything that potentially extends a drive for the opponent. There were way too many of those that happened last year as well. Discipline penalties are also things that need to be reduced. All right. We talk about showing feistiness. Well, that's fine. You can show feistiness, but when the feistiness manifests itself into stupid penalties where you get called for unsportsmanlike penalties, you can't have that either, because that's 15 yards. And in some cases, it could be an automatic ejection, depending on the severity of the penalty. So discipline is a big thing for the Giants. I mentioned blowout losses. All right. Giants need to play their games a lot closer. They had too many blowout losses last year. They just couldn't keep up. Now they've got a tough slate of opponents. We all know that. But if they could somehow keep the games close with some of these upper echelon teams that they're going to face, consider that progress in the right direction. And just again, overall, is this team better by week 18 than it was in week 1? Progress is never linear. There's going to be ups and downs. But if you see the same thing going on week after week after week, the same mistakes happening, that's when you got to say to yourself, this team isn't making progress. So there's a lot of things that need to come together for the Giants to show progress. It's not just one answer. It's not just win, 9 games or have a 500 or better record. That would all be nice. And I think that would all develop if some of the things that I talked about just now were to come to fruition. So the Giants absolutely need to show progress. Those are some quick definitions of what they can show ownership as having made progress from week 1 to week 18 of the season. If a playoff berth comes about this season, even better. That's going to be huge progress. But bottom line, you can't have another 3-win season. You can't have another 6-win season. This team's got to do better than that. I don't need to tell you that. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but still, that's progress. All right, item number 2. Are Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll in danger? I don't think they are. I know what you're probably thinking. Okay, well, what if they don't show progress? How can ownership possibly justify keeping those two in their positions? Let me explain, and I'm going to start with Joe Schoen first. Joe Schoen, his job is to assemble the roster, to go out, get the right guys in accordance with his discussion with the coaching staff, to get the best possible guys for the team. I mentioned the drafts. Can we all agree that the last couple of draft classes, this year's and last year's, at least on paper, and based on what we saw of last year's class, can we all agree that those classes have been better? All right. So as I mentioned, as the Giants continue to draft, add through the draft, and develop these guys, assuming that they do develop these guys, you're going to start to see a younger core foundation for this team that's going to be instrumental in taking it through to success. Schoen, thus far, I can't think of any moves that he's made in the last, maybe 2 years. I mean, now some of you will say, well, what about Saquon? What about Xavier McKinney? You can make those arguments, but overall, I don't think Schoen has made any moves that you can honestly sit there and say, my gosh, that's going to hurt the team at the end. Again, some of you will say, well, Saquon. Some of you will say Xavier McKinney. They brought in Tyrone Tracy Jr., who showed promise. Now, he's not at the same level as Saquon. I get it. But there's again, that need for progress. And if Tracy can build on what he started last year, then maybe the running game won't be as bad as we think it might be. Same thing in the defensive secondary. Tyler Nubin. All right, Tyler Nubin, they brought in Javon Holland. Let's not forget about him. So is it possible that those guys can make us forget about the guys that they lost? It could happen. But overall, you look at some of the moves that Schoen has made, trading back into the first round for Jackson Dart, the future quarterback, getting Russell Wilson in here on a 1-year deal, the free agent moves he made, acquiring Brian Burns for and not having to spend a first-round pick. All positive moves for Joe Schoen so far in building up this roster. Now, there's going to be mistakes. They're going to pop up. No offseason is perfect. But, again, the Giants under Joe Schoen kind of heading in the right direction as far as the roster building. And I just want to end this particular segment here by saying that championships are not awarded in the offseason. I get that. All right. Nobody is going to give the Giants a trophy because they had a good offseason or what we perceive to be a good offseason. But there's room to be optimistic. We can honestly sit here and say that Joe Schoen made a strong effort to address some of the most glaring weaknesses on this team that has held this team back, not just last year, but the year prior. And that for that reason, I think if they continue to do that, there will be more opportunities for Joe Schoen to add to this cache of players that they had built up. Now, obviously, the second part of that is the head coach. And is Brian Daboll on the hot seat? And what does his future hold? That we'll talk about right after this. Hey, Giant fans, ever check your bank account and wonder where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending all in one place, so you just stop managing your money and start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Since I've started using Monarch Money, I have a better handle on where my earnings go, and I've been better able to budget my monthly spending. So go on and take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use promo code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com to get 50% off your first year. Again, that's monarchmoney.com, and that promo code for half off your first year is Locked On NFL. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. Coming up this week, the Giants are back at OTA number 9. Actually, the Giants have been at OTA. They had one on Monday. I think they have one on Tuesday. They're off Wednesday. Back for OTA number 9, which happens to be the next time the media is in the building. So just as I've done the last couple of weeks after the OTA is done, I'll give you my takeaways, what was said, what I observed, all that good stuff. So if you have questions, obviously you can pop them into the comments box. I do see the comments. I try to look at the comments once a day. And if there's something in particular you want me to keep an eye on, I'll happily take a look for you and try to work it into the report. So that's coming up. And then speaking of which, how about we do a mailbag on Friday? We haven't done one of those in a long, long time. So if you want to get in on the mailbag, information on how to send your questions is in the show notes. So please go ahead and take a look at that. That's the easiest way to do it. So this way I know that I have your questions and I can go through them and make sure I answer them. Because sometimes questions get posted, 2 or 3 days after I post a show, and I don't always see them. So I try to, but sometimes I miss them. So that's coming up. And then next week, Giants have mandatory minicamp. Ed Valentine and I will get together for a preview show on mandatory minicamp. So we'll talk about that. And I have a guest that I'm trying to get the book for next week's show once things wrap up. So lots still to come here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Hope you will check it all out. All right, at the end of last segment, I started to answer a question about, are Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll in danger of losing their positions if the Giants don't have a successful season? And I talked about Joe Schoen. I'm going to talk about Brian Daboll now. Now, unless the locker room were to completely fall apart, I mean, we're talking like losing control of the locker room, I don't think Brian Daboll is going to get fired after this year, regardless of what the record is. Even if, the record is like another 3-win game. And I say that with an asterisk, because if injuries factor into the equation and the Giants only managed 3 wins, I think management takes that into consideration. But if the Giants only win 3 games, and it's because the team is undisciplined, unprepared, just looks sloppy, if there's disruption in the locker room, then Daboll's in trouble. I have no reason to think that any of that will happen, although I can't predict with injuries, obviously. So why do I think Brian Daboll is on a little bit more stable ground than maybe some people are giving him credit for? The answer is Jackson Dart. All right. Now, this team, this regime, Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, did extensive work on the quarterbacks this year. Jackson Dart was the guy that Brian Daboll wanted. If Jackson Dart ends up sitting for most of this year, as is expected to be the plan, and the Giants, for whatever reason, have another lousy year, I don't think that it makes sense for the Giants to say, okay, you know what, Brian, you're not seeing year 5 of your contract. We're going to bring somebody else in here. No, I think what will happen is management, or I should say ownership, is going to commit to Daboll for at least another year. Let him develop Jackson Dart. He's working with Jackson Dart now, obviously. You know, at the OTAs, Daboll is right there every time Dart throws a pass, every time Dart comes back from the huddle. He's right there to give him feedback. You're going to ultimately want to see that next step. And that next step is when Jackson Dart gets into games. Now, Jackson Dart isn't getting into games until later in the year, and he shows some progress and he shows promise. Daboll will be back. All right. Record notwithstanding. I really believe that because, look, nobody out there believes that the Giants, well, I should say nobody outside of maybe 1925 Giants Drive believes that the Giants are going to win the Super Bowl or even be in the Super Bowl or even sniff the Super Bowl for that matter. All right. So I spoke about progress and what they're potentially looking at and what that could look like in terms of Jackson Dart. That's a big part of it. The progress of that young man. And Daboll is the guy. I mean, remember, this is why they hired Brian Daboll in part because of his work with Josh Allen and his work with the offense up in Buffalo. He was saddled with Daniel Jones the last several years. Tried to make a go of it, couldn't. Giants had to move on. So now they're saying, okay, Brian, you picked your guy, develop him, and let's see where it goes. So I do think the Giants will give Brian Daboll a 5th year, regardless of what happens, unless, again, the locker room completely implodes, which I do not see happening. If it hasn't happened by now, I don't see it happening in the coming year. I think Brian and Joe both get another year, even if the Giants don't make the playoffs, as long as there's that progress. And it's a fine line. I get it. It's tricky, but I do think their seats are a little cooler than what maybe people are giving them credit for. All right. The next question. What is the biggest question heading into training camp? Now, some people will say, well, it's the quarterback position. But folks, look, unless Russell Wilson gets injured between now and the start of training camp, he's going to be the starter going into camp. He will remain the starter, regardless of how Jackson Dart looks in the preseason, regardless of how Tommy DeVito or Jameis Winston look. That's why Russell Wilson was brought in. He is not the long-term answer. That's why he only got a 1-year contract. So the quarterback question, in my mind, it's not really a question. It's kind of been answered. The biggest question for me is the offensive line, right? The Giants, the plan is to return the same 5 guys that they started the season with last year. Andrew Thomas, John Runyon Jr., John Michael Schmitz, Greg Van Roten, and Jermaine Illuminor, to have the continuity. But here's the thing. Could it be that maybe we see the original plan for the offensive line? And what was the original plan, you ask? Well, originally, Jermaine Illuminor was supposed to play left guard, John Runyon Jr. was supposed to play right guard, and Evan Neal was supposed to play right tackle. But could we see the Giants shuffle the offensive line and maybe go back to some of the original plan for that unit? So to just recap what the original plan was last year before Evan Neal had his setback, the tackles were supposed to be Thomas and Neal. The guards, left guard was supposed to be Illuminor. Right guard was supposed to be Runyon Jr. And center was John Michael Schmitz. Now, this spring, John Runyon Jr. has been sitting out while he continues his rehab from shoulder and ankle issues. Andrew Thomas has been sitting out. Evan Neal has been getting snaps at times with the starters at left guard, not right guard, left guard. So I wonder if perhaps the plan, or maybe what they're hoping for, is that Evan Neal will show enough progress to where they can put him in at left guard, move John Runyon Jr. over to right guard. Now that would displace Greg Van Roten, but in Van Roten, you would have an interior guy who could play guard or center, either guard or center spot. All right. So you have versatility there. And then you've got, young Jake Kubas, who's developing into a guard center. Maybe he goes to the practice squad. Maybe he sticks. I don't know. You've got your swing tackles in James Hudson the third. Stone Forsythe's going to compete for a spot too. And of course, the rookie Marcus Bowe. So you have talent there. And I forgot to mention, obviously, Joshua Zudu, who's going to, it looks like he's going to continue to work at guard and tackle, but more so at tackle. And I'm still not sure why they keep playing him out there, but I guess they just want to see if he's made any progress. But the bottom line with the offensive line and why it's a question mark is because what is it going to look like? I don't think we can honestly say that it's slam dunk. It's going to look like the starting unit of last year, which, by the way, was a pretty good looking unit. For the first 6 games of the season, that offensive line, Thomas, Runyon, Schmitz, Van Roten, and Illuminor, they played pretty well. It was when the injuries started that things started to fall apart for them. So I think that, ideally they would like to keep the same unit, but Evan Neal, look, as a run blocker, he's pretty good. It's just, can he handle the inside duties as a pass protector? That's where the question is. The depth needs to be sorted out. That's where the question is. And it doesn't matter, who the quarterback is. It doesn't matter who the receivers are. If that offensive line isn't ready to go, if it isn't solidified, and again, on paper, it looks like it is, then it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. We're going to be in for another long year. And hopefully it's not going to be like that. Because as I mentioned at the top of the show, Joe Schoen did a pretty good job, in my opinion, of addressing some of the most glaring issues on this team, issues that have just been lingering on and on and on for a number of years. That's one of them, by the way. All right. The next question, comeback kids. All right. So I'm specifically talking about 2 guys, one on offense, one on defense. We'll start with offense. And actually, both of these guys have something in common, right, in that they struggled last year. So you have receiver Jalen Hyatt on the offensive side of the ball. Jalen Hyatt has been seeing a lot of snaps this spring with Malik Neighbors' sideline with the toe issue, and he's looked pretty good. Now, you all know that the Giants flirted a little bit with Gabe Davis, who Brian Daboll had up in Buffalo. Gabe Davis came in kind of a checkup sort of thing. Where is he in his knee in rehab? You wonder if perhaps that lit a fire under Jalen Hyatt, because the idea, I think, if the Giants were to sign Gabe Davis, that gives them now another outside threat. Maybe that can push Malik Neighbors into the slot where he can be just as effective as he was on the outside and gives the offense a few new wrinkles that they can unveil. Well, what's to say that maybe if Jalen Hyatt continues to show development, maybe he can be that role that maybe they're looking for Gabe Davis to fill. It's possible, right? I mean, Jalen Hyatt, the thing with him is he's got great straight ahead speed, but the Giants don't just need a track star. What they need from Jalen Hyatt is a guy who can win the contested catches, who can also do downfield blocking, which is something that he struggled with. But most importantly, on those deep balls that they're planning or hoping to incorporate into the offense, they need for Jalen Hyatt to better track the ball and come down with it. Because last year he didn't catch any of those deep balls that he was targeted on. So if Hyatt continues to show progress in that regard, there's no reason to think that they might say, you know what, maybe we don't need Gabe Davis. Maybe we've got our guy now in Jalen Hyatt. This is year 3. It's a make or break year for this kid. He's been working at it. He's added some bulk, some muscle to better hold up, especially in the blocking and the physical aspect of the game, which he struggled with. I mean, how many times did we see him last year go up for a contested ball and he was out muscled for it? So Jalen Hyatt, that's a big one for the Giants, a comeback, if you will, from a career that's basically stalled since the Giants moved up to draft him in the 3rd round. So hopefully for him, because he's a good kid, he works at it. I'd like to see him make progress. And We'll see if it translates, because right now everybody looks good in shorts and sneakers. So we'll see if he makes progress there. Now, coming up next, I'll tell you about the defensive player that needs to step up and potentially could be a comeback kid, if you will. So don't go anywhere. I'll have that for you right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And continuing from where we left off in the last segment, the two players, one on offense, one on defense, that can be comeback players, if you will. Not just, I'm not talking injuries. I'm talking about from rocky performances. I talked about the offensive side of the ball. Defensively, I'm going to talk about Deonte Banks, cornerback. Now, here are the reasons why I think Deonte Banks is going to be better this year. Number one, he's not going to have the responsibility of tracking the opponent's wide receiver one. That's going to go to Paulson Adebo. But number two, we talk about sometimes how when a player goes to another team and gets a fresh start, and sometimes he can be like a new guy all over again. Well, the Giants, remember, they brought in a new defensive backs coach. So in a way, that's kind of like a fresh start for Deonte Banks. It's the same system, Shane Bowen's system, but maybe you bring in somebody now who teaches it a little bit better to you, to where you're more engaged, to where you're asking better questions and you're understanding what your role is within the defense. And going back to what Shane Bowen said last week about Deonte Banks, a question that I had asked him, he said that Banks has been energetic, he's been more invested, he's been asking questions, just more into it. That could be the effect of having a new coach. Because look, let's not downplay that. Sometimes, you get a teacher, and even though the teacher might be very good at what they do, sometimes their communication style doesn't resonate with a student. And all it takes is to get somebody whose style does resonate with you. And then a guy can basically bounce back and have, be the guy that you thought you were getting. So I think with Deonte Banks, that gives me reason to believe that he's going to be better this year. Not having to deal with the wide receiver one and having a different or a change of scenery in the classroom. And, oh, by the way, it doesn't hurt that they brought in veterans like Javon Holland and Paulson Adebo, who can serve as kind of mentors to help this kid, especially if he gets stuck. I don't know that he had that really, as much as maybe they would have liked last year. So that's going to make a difference as well. All right. I got one more for you, and that is whose seat, if it's not Brian Daboll and if it's not Joe Schoen, whose seat is the hottest? Folks, I'm going to go with Shane Bowen. Now, Shane Bowen last year, if we're giving him the benefit of the doubt, we could say that he didn't have the personnel he needed to do what he wanted to do on defense. So therefore, he tried to stretch guys' talents, and maybe in the process that resulted in square pegs getting fitted into round holes. That being said, Bowen has gotten a lot of resources this year between the draft, between free agency. If that defense does not look better this year, from pass rush to takeaways to stopping the run, if those three things don't look improved, then you've got to ask yourself if he's the right guy for this job. It's that simple. There should be no excuses here. Right now, maybe injuries, I suppose. But again, the Giants added so much on the defensive line as far as depth. They're as deep as I can recall them being in this Brian Daboll era at pass rusher. They've got decent depth on the back end. So even if there are injuries, it shouldn't be catastrophic. All right. So again, Shane Bowen needs to show improvement with his unit. He's got the talent. I don't think he's going to have to stretch guys to the point where, he's going to ask somebody to do something that they're just not a fit for. But of course, we'll see. Proof's going to be in the pudding. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen today. For your second listen, please check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast. As training camps get closer and moves are being made, hosts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. You can find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Giant fans, I'll see you next time. Take care.